My name is Daniel, and I'm going to present this paper called Reducing Objective Function Mismatch in Deep Clustering with Unsupervised Companion Objective. This is work done together with Robert Jensen and Michael Kampfmeier at the UiT Machine Learning Group, where I'm an PhD student. So first, I guess we'll have to talk a little bit about what deep clustering is, and then we'll get into some, I guess, some problems with current deep clustering models with respect to similarity preservation, and also how that problem is frequently addressed using autoencoders. Then you maybe get into a new problem, which is this objective function mismatch, which we refer to in the title. And then I'll present our solution, which is or our attempt at mitigating this mismatch, which is the unsupervised companion objective. And then finally, we'll have a look at some experiments and the results. So deep clustering, it's a pretty recent field in machine learning. I think papers started popping up maybe around 2015, 2016. And it's basically just as the name implies, that you use deep neural networks to do clustering. So you have this this setup in the figure here on the right, where you basically take your favorite neural network, and then you attach a clustering module which predicts the cluster assignments, and then you train this whole thing using a clustering loss function. So a lot of the the important contributions in this field are with respect to this loss function and also the clustering module. So what was quickly discovered was that this clustering loss may corrupt the feature space, in the sense that you don't really preserve the local similarities that are present in the dataset. So samples that should be similar in the input space, or samples that are similar in the input space, aren't necessarily similar in the representation space produced by your neural network. So that would mean that the clustering module sort of gets bad features, and it means that those features are unsuitable for clustering. So what people started to do, as this figure is an example of, is to use an autoencoder model and incorporate this clustering loss and the clustering module in the hidden space of the autoencoder, in order to sort of preserve this local structure, which is the term used by this paper that this figure is from. But when you do this, you give the network two different tasks, both clustering task and also a reconstruction task. So what can happen in this case is that you introduce something which is called objective function mismatch, and that's when you have basically a mismatch between your clustering objective and the reconstruction objective. So you minimize your reconstruction objective, and that actually worsens the clustering performance if you have this effect. So in the figure on the right, you can see that they train. So this example is a bit anecdotal, but they train a variational autoencoder, and then they have a few-shot classifier on top of the hidden representation of the autoencoder. So so you can see, the accuracy increases in the early stages of training, so your representations become better and better, and you're able to get the higher classification accuracy. But then at some point during training of the autoencoder, the accuracy starts to decrease. So you sort of get this change of phases where you first have an increase in accuracy, and then in later stages you see that it starts to decrease again. And I think there's a pretty intuitive explanation for this, and it's that you know, the features which are good for clustering aren't, or classification in this case, aren't necessarily good for reconstruction. So the goal of this work is to see if we can introduce some better similarity preservation without introducing too much of this objective function mismatch. So what we do is to attach a clustering loss function to each layer in the network, and this clustering loss function should also be or it should be trained to enforce a consistent clustering structure throughout the network. So we basically modify the model like this, and then we train, or we design these companion objectives, as we call them. We design them to reflect the same clustering structure as the one identified by the clustering module. So we basically train the network to have visible clusters in all of the layers in the network. So you take these companion objectives and then just add them with some weights if you want to, and you just add them to the clustering loss, so you can train the whole model without any modifications to the training strategy. So how do we enforce this clustering structure? Well, we do it by estimating a probability density function for each cluster at each layer output, and we do that by, so this is sort of an implicit estimate, but we estimate this this probability density function, and then we compute this Cauchy-Schwarz divergence between clusters. So when we maximize the CS divergence, we make the clusters both separable and compact in the layer, or at the layer outputs. So the reason I say that the density estimate is implicit is that if you use a kernel density estimator with a Gaussian kernel, you can show that this this Cauchy-Schwarz divergence can be written just in terms of these cluster assignments alpha, and also a kernel evaluated at the samples. Yes. So some experiments. So we take this model named deep divergence space clustering. It's a model earlier developed by Mikael and others. And we add this unsupervised companion objective to that model. And we get this DDC-UCO model. And also we have like a simple baseline model, which is DDC, where we add a decoder and a reconstruction loss. So I've called it DDC AE for autoencoder. So as we can see here, when we add the unsupervised companion objective, we tend to improve, I would say, the overall clustering performance. If you compare the third row and the last row here, you can see that the results are somewhat better when we include the companion objective. And also it's interesting to note here that when we add an autoencoder to DDC, it doesn't really improve the performance at all. But that's just like the main clustering metrics, but we are more interested in this objective function mismatch particularly. So of course, if we want to evaluate the presence of objective function mismatch, we need to measure it somehow. And then so in this paper, we use a measure which is based on this feature drift, which is from a pretty recent paper. And you basically take the cosine between the gradients of the two different losses. So you take the gradient of your clustering loss with respect to the network parameters, and you take the gradient of the pretext loss. That would be the unsupervised companion objective in our case, or the reconstruction loss in an autoencoder. Yeah, you take that gradient with respect to the network parameters as well, and then you compute the cosine between those two gradients. And then we've just introduced a small reparametrization so that the measure will be a bit more intuitive because we're measuring the mismatch. So you want, so this measure satisfies that when the OFM is 0, you basically have no mismatch. And when it's 1, you have the maximum amount of mismatch. Yeah, so we basically ask whether or not the gradients of these two losses pull the learning dynamics in the same direction. So yeah, this is a plot that shows the result of measuring the objective function mismatch throughout training for the DDC with the unsupervised companion objective and also DDC with the autoencoder. I think we produced this plot is from the truncated version of the MNIST dataset. So what we see first is that when you have the unsupervised companion objective, you get a lower value. So you get less objective function mismatch in this case when compared to using an autoencoder. And also there's a lot more variability when you have the autoencoder, and we're not quite sure why this is, but it might be that these two losses sort of they maybe they argue more about what direction they want to go. Another interesting thing is that for when we have the unsupervised companion objective, we can see a clear increasing trend. So you get more and more mismatch when you the longer you train. And we haven't really investigated this very thoroughly, but we hypothesize that in the early phases or in the early stages of training, these two losses work together to sort of identify and strengthen the clustering structure. But as you get as you continue to train, the clustering loss in DDC wants to make these clusters in the representation space or in the space produced by the network. It wants to make clusters very separable and very compact. And the way to do that is to map each cluster to distinct points and then just collapse all the samples within a cluster into that point. And that's not as easy to do in the earlier layers where the unsupervised companion objective is working because of the limited representational power in the network at that stage. So yeah, that's our current hypothesis on this increasing trend in the mismatch. Yes, I think that's my talk. So are there any questions?